So we are back in Luke chapter 6, looking at verses 39 to 42, really as we're kind of working through this idea of the blind spots that we deal with. And last time we were together, we talked about false teachers and false teaching. And now today, I really want to kind of drill down a little bit on the idea of our own blind spots, of trying to help others get the speck out of their own eye when we're still dealing with a log in our own eye. And
that sounds painful.
Well, it is. And one of the things that tends to happen with us is we have painful places in our lives that cause us blind spots. And yet, when we're going around, we just kind of ignore those things, and they consume us, and they keep us from being who we really are, or being able to give really helpful, godly advice to others. But we ignore them. We just continue to go on, and we don't pay attention to the fact that very often we're operating out of our wounds. And I think that's a common problem for us.
I mean, when you brought up the subject to me, that we were going to talk about it today, it really it hit home to me. I don't see how it can't hit home to anybody.
Seems like it.
But a couple weeks ago, without getting into too much detail here, I was going through a really hard time, and I'm in the worship band here at church and do several other things and do the podcast. And because I was going through this difficult time, it felt nearly impossible to me to be able to minister not only in the way that I wanted to, but in the way that I should. I didn't want to, I had to deal with my own junk, first of all, and
yeah, it's hard to worship in spirit and in
right.
truth if our spirit is being misaligned
right.
by all of the junk that's going on in our lives, and that misaligned spirit keeps us from being able to actually think thoughts that align with truth.
Right, and something as simple as just stuff in life becoming just so overwhelming. Yeah. It's not, it doesn't have to be some like, oh, I did a horrible thing. It's just life, right. Coming at you. And when that gets so overwhelming and you don't deal with it, how can you minister to others? So I think that we often forget that, and we try to ignore our stuff. Right. And as a result, I think that can be kind of dangerous if we continue to try to, minister to others. You were talking before we started recording, when you start to recognize your sin or your own wounds or what you might be going through, it can also affect how you treat other people.
For sure.
And, it can almost make you more judgmental, and like we were talking about, I don't know if that's to alleviate our own guilt when we're going through things like that, but yeah. I think it's a dangerous game to play not to recognize your own garbage.
Yeah, I mean it's funny in the sense of being ironic, but it's a real tragedy to see, but it's pretty common, pretty normal for us when we are dealing with junk, particularly sin, wounds as well, but particularly unconfessed sin, whether it's, what some folks might call a besetting sin, that thing that constantly plagues us, or just something that we're not letting go of, pride, bitterness, right. Any number of things, or trying to protect a lie in our lives, that,
right.
or our reputation, or any of those things. When we're holding on to those things, it almost seems to heighten our awareness of what righteousness should be, and it makes us keenly aware of the sin in others, or the shortcomings in others, or the foolishness in others. I know if I'm not right, if I'm not for any number of reasons, if it's
right.
Unconfessed sin in my life, or I'm starting to wade into the waters of pride and not on my knees before the cross, then I get very, very I get more, let's say, irritated with the foolish choices of the world. I look around at the world around me and all of the just ridiculous things that we look at that don't make any sense, and I get very indignant and fired up about it. And I get more bothered by the world's sinfulness and foolishness when I'm not right in my own heart, right. As opposed to Jesus weeping, as he's entering Jerusalem. Jerusalem is representative of the entire rebellion of Israel. So as he's seeing Jerusalem, he's weeping for Jerusalem. He's really weeping for all of God's people as represented on Zion's Hill there, because they're not repenting, they're not turning. And he's like, if you had just received this, if you had just turned to the Lord, the glories would be unbelievable. But instead, you're going to be at the pinnacle of the worst part of human history. And he knows that, and he sees that. And what tends to happen to me, Jesus is that way, with that compassion in the midst of his perfection of love. But for me, when I get into those places where my unconfessed sin, my pride, whatever, causes me to be particularly indignant about these things, then I get riled up and angry rather than compassionate. So rather than looking at, whatever progressive mentality is out there that's telling us that sin isn't sin, and saying, boy, these people are like sheep without a shepherd, and my heart's breaking for them, weeping for them, praying for them, and striving to share Jesus with them, and willing to die on the cross for them. Instead, I'm like, where's my sword?
Right.
Where's the sword of wrath? The judgment is ready to come. And that reminds me, Jesse and I were working on the Casting Crowns song, Jesus, Friend of Sinners, and it talks about how we cut down people in your name, but the sword was never ours to swing. We are supposed to be friends of sinners, not participating with them, but coming alongside to say, look, there's a better way. There's hope. There's grace if you will repent. And the only way for us to do that is to share truth.
Right.
We can't love without truth. But man, sometimes we want to wield that truth like a sword, and I fall right into that.
And that tends to push people away more often than not.
That's absolutely true. In fact, we're told that it's the kindness.
If someone's coming at you with a sword, you're going to get
You're
scared
gonna
and run away.
Right? Yeah, that's not pleasant. So, as we're looking at how the whole the whole thing works, our sinfulness, our hardness of heart, our woundedness, and we've talked about this 1,000 times. Pain always makes us selfish.
Well, that's the other thing. We're talking about our active sins, but it's also important to acknowledge, I think, the woundedness of not letting go,
right,
and not just saying, God save me, I can't do this on my own, help me.
Yeah. And that pain causes so much in us that pain leaves scars. It leaves scar tissue, and if you've ever had a cut that required stitches or a surgical wound or something that's deep, when that heals up, there's a bump there. There's a lump, a hardness that can continue to be painful, and then eventually becomes sort of numb. That happens to us emotionally and spiritually when these wounds are here and we don't take them to the cross or we do, but we don't release them at the cross. We'll take them to the cross, but we pick them back up again, and we keep living in that wound, and the scar tissue that builds up over it hardens us and keeps us from being able to be fully surrendered and able to see things through the eyes of Christ. And if we don't get focused on the scriptures, then our emotions take over, and you alluded to that earlier. If I've got all this stuff, that's all I'm going to see. And the old saying, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If I'm wounded, I see everything through that lens of my wound. If I'm inside in turmoil over unconfessed sin, then my inner self is going to see the world through that lens. And whether that's in judgment of everybody who's a part of that sin or whatever else, the enemy is going to work really hard to get my back up against it. So I'm going to get all agitated and defensive, and I'm going to call out people in
and
their
that makes
sin.
it harder to get out of it.
Absolutely does, because it feeds the pride.
Right.
And pride seems to be at the root of most everything. James MacDonald has said numerous times that at the bottom, at the root of all of the sins that we deal with, somewhere in there is fear. And I would take it even a step farther. Somewhere in the midst of that fear is always pride. It's always about me, and pride keeps me from seeing anything else but what's going on. So if I'm battling, at the risk of using popular words, if I'm battling low self-esteem, if I'm really looking at myself as a loser, that's a form of pride because my eyes are on me rather than on Christ. If my eyes are on Christ, then as Paul said in Romans 12, I can view myself with sober judgment, not thinking of myself more highly than I ought, but to think of myself through the lens of Christ. And at that point, it's not so much that I'm debasing myself. I'm not thinking of myself.
Right.
I'm focused on him, and because I'm focused on him, I'm focused on others. And I'm an afterthought. But that's not normal for us.
Right.
Most of the time, it's about my needs. Well, I deserve better than this. I should be treated better than this. I don't have to put up with those kinds of things. What about my rights? Why don't you recognize that I'm equal in value to you? The fact that I'm fighting for those rights means I've already lost the battle. And I'm in this spot because of worldly, fleshly thinking. And I can't get past that. I can't have an illuminated thought if I'm darkened by the flesh, by the sin and the wound and all the things that go into that. So
what can we do about it? Because it's like you just said, it's human nature, I think, to get into these habits.
It is, yeah. And I would say that the first step is to recognize it. And, we've been talking about Luke 6, and to go back to it, the text that we're actually looking at is Luke 6, verses 39 to 42. And Jesus was talking about false teaching and false teachers, as we talked about last time, and also these blind spots in our own lives. Mm-hmm. It says in verse 39, he also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So whoever you're following, you're going to end up at the same destination because you're on the same path. So we will always end up like those that we follow, that we listen to in podcasts, or we read in books, or sit under their teaching. And he goes on in verse 41 and 42 to say, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? Interestingly, that same Casting Crowns song talks about plank-eyed saints, and that's
sounds like an insult. A plank eye.
A plank eye. Or a 90s band.
That's true.
But you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. Jesus talks a lot about being able to help our brothers and to judge rightly. We focus so much on the don't judge, but Jesus does, while he does say don't judge, he also says judge rightly. So there's a different concept in play. Don't judge in the sense of condemning. That's the passage right before this, starting in verse 37. Don't judge, you will not be judged. Don't condemn, you'll not be condemned. But that doesn't mean we throw away our brain. We take away discernment of truth, that we stop thinking about what is right and what is wrong. We do need to judge rightly, but we can't do that while I'm still dealing with this log sticking out of my eye.
Rightly being the key word.
Rightly being the key word. And rightly is not judged by my decisions. It's
right.
judged by the Word of God.
Right.
So when we see bad fruit on the tree, we need to address that out of love, because we're called to restore one another. And Galatians 6 talks about restoring one another when we're caught in sin. I think it's verse 1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. It's kind of an important word, gently, because when we're identifying with them as people that we love and we recognize, man, I've been there, I get it.
Right. It's not that sword wielding.
Right. I'm not trying to say how terrible you are. I want to help you off of this dangerous path. Again, to steal from McDonald, there's a hole in that road. If you continue down that road, you're going to fall into a pit. I want to help you out of that. Not because I'm better than you, but because I get it. I've been there. So gently restoring that person. And he goes on in that same verse to say, but watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. We can't do that. We can't take ourselves down that bad road. Carry each other's burdens in verse 2. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. So if I'm going to carry somebody else's burdens, I better have my burdens under control. That doesn't mean I don't have any issues in my life. That would be unrealistic this side of heaven. But I know how to release those burdens at the cross. It's not that I don't sin, it's that I don't hang on to that sin. I don't have unconfessed sin. I don't have sin I'm trying to protect. If I've got secrets, I'm going to be in a bad place to be able to help others. So that your question of how do we do that, it starts with awareness and being able to let go of that, to recognize, wait a minute, I can't help somebody else if I haven't surrendered this part of my life to the blood of Christ and let the Spirit guide me through that.
And oftentimes, it's like you just touched on, those sins that we've experienced, those things that we've gone through, we can then turn those around and use those as tools for others.
That's absolutely right.
And I'm not saying, I should sin so I can go help somebody. But right. Everyone goes through stuff. Everyone does stuff. Everyone, we have these things that happen. And if you don't feel like you can turn that around and surrender it and then do something better, right. then what's the point?
Well, in the book of Hebrews talks about Jesus as our high priest who knows what we've been through.
Right.
So he's able to help us because he can identify.
Right.
Now, he could identify before because we don't have any emotions he didn't give us.
Right.
But the reality of this is that we can recognize, we can really identify with him because he's faced everything we've faced and yet was without sin. We can look at Jesus and say, okay, he gets me.
Yeah.
He's been through this. He's faced it. And we can allow him to help us in that way, in a way that we wouldn't if it were just some religious figure, or even in to a large extent, I guess, when we're talking about the invisible God, mm-hmm. who is holy and beyond. It's hard for us to imagine that God can identify with what we've gone through.
Right.
So God proved it by saying, "Okay, here I am. I'm walking through this with you, in the dirt, in the mud. I'm down in this with you." And when we seek to restore others that same way, not because we ourselves, are better, but we're down in the mud with them, getting our hands dirty just like God does in Christ with us. We can be of use to others. But we can't do that if we're separated, if we think we're better than them, or if we're stuck in the same mud, flailing about, not getting anywhere. We've got to be able to provide a better answer because the renewing of our mind has allowed the Spirit to transform us from inside.
So get your stuff right.
There you go.
All right, we'll end it there. Thanks, guys.